we have moved on from the Renaissance in Southern Europe, which was quite dense, to a less dense topic, and that is going to be the Renaissance in Northern Europe. Okay, the Northern Europe has a lot of kind of comparisons to the Southern Europe Renaissance to begin with. It is influenced heavily by the Southern Europe Renaissance, but let's go ahead and start with the 15th century, right? So what we see is much smaller artworks in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe during this time period, which is the kind of period that was ripe for the Renaissance in Southern Europe, right? At the same time, however, what we see is much more detailed and much more realistic detail than what we saw in the Southern European art, and that is mostly because of the usage of oil paints. So we saw in the Southern European Renaissance, a lot of it was frescoes, which are a little bit tougher to manage, right? Whereas oil paints are you can go into much funner detail with, right? And so while we see the Renaissance in Southern Europe occurring, right? So while we have the Renaissance in Southern Europe, what we are seeing is Northern Europe is still kind of in the last throes of the Gothic style, right? And so the other thing that we see that's different, or another thing that we see different, is the influence of the kind of classical styles, right? The Greeks and the Romans is less impactful in Northern Europe than Southern Europe because they're not near the epicenter of Greece and Italy, right? Especially Italy, right? So yeah, they didn't have that same Roman connection. So they have a lack of that kind of Roman connection that Italy did, and then on top of that, they are just not as close to the ancient artworks, right? And so it's harder for them to study those artworks, right? So yeah, that's kind of the major differences there. But as we move into the 16th century, right? As we move into the 16th century, we see that the Northern European art shows a far greater awareness of the Italian Renaissance than it did in the previous section or the previous century of the Italian Renaissance, right? And some of those reasons, right, is that we see artists travel to Southern Europe from Northern Europe to learn from the masters, right? And then they bring those ideas back with them, right? We also see engravers copying a lot of those Italian works and distributing them, especially in Northern Europe, right? And yeah, so these would become available throughout Europe, not just in Southern Europe, right? And so that spread the ideas and styles of the Renaissance. And then lastly, we start to see growth in trade connections, right? Trade between the German cities and the Italian cities. The German merchants, specifically the German merchants of the Hanseatic League and Venice, especially, right? Creates another avenue of influence, right? And so what we do see, though, instead of a full-on adoption of Italian Renaissance styles, right, we tend to see a more traditional approach to art in the Northern Renaissance than we did in the Southern, right? Less drastic changes, right? And so we see the major kind of innovations of linear perspective and the different uses of color. They do come northward, but they are utilized differently in the Northern Renaissance than they are in the Southern Renaissance. Okay. And so we talk about, so starting with kind of get a little more detailed in the 15th and early 16th centuries, we see Southern Germany flower in terms of their artistic output. And the two artists that they bring to mind here is Matthias Grunwald. Or Grunwald. And Albrecht Dürer. Oops. Albrecht Dürer. The Umlaut brothers. So Matthias Grunwald, I misspelled that. That's an A right there. Is 1475 to 1528. And Albrecht Dürer is 1471 to 1528. So it's nice that they share the same death date, at least for our purposes. And they're considered the greatest artists of the Northern Renaissance. You actually see the Northern Renaissance probably hit harder, not in art per se. I mean, it hits very hard in art. But it's especially kind of important for the growth of William Shakespeare, right? Greatest artists of the Northern Renaissance, right? So for Grunwald, let's start with him. Only 10 works of art remain of his, right? But his influence is quite notable. He's known especially for his religious scenes, and especially in particular of Christ's crucifixion. For those who don't know, that is when Jesus Christ is tied to the cross and dies, right? And the particular artwork that they want us to focus on is the Eisenheim altarpiece, right, which was made between 1510 and 1515, right? It has, let's see, it's got 9 panels. So it's a altarpiece, so it's it's more of a sculpture per se. It is both an artwork, but also like a sculpture almost. But it's not really a sculpture. I shouldn't say that. 9 panels, and we have 2 sets of folding wings. Okay, they didn't actually provide a picture of this, I believe, in the resource, right? But let's take a look at it ourselves here if we can. There we go. Okay, so here you can see kind of the 2 sets, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Did I say 6? Sorry, there are 9 panels. I can't quite see the 9 panels. Maybe they're kind of covered up. But here you can see, again, the crucifixion of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene here, and stuff like that. Here he is being buried, which he will rise from the dead, right? I'm assuming that could be Judas. I can't really tell. But yeah, you kind of have this whole, this altarpiece considered to be his masterwork, right? Okay. And then we're going to talk about Dürer. See if I can make something look good here. All right, so Albrecht Dürer, let's see here. Let me scroll down. He's the most famous artist of Reformation Germany. Reformation Germany being where the Protestant Reformation got its origins, right? Right. So where it seems like Grunwald was still a Catholic. I think they're trying to say that Dürer was not. He was now a Protestant, right? And so he's highly influenced by his early training, at any rate, is influenced by the late Gothic works. He's influenced by the late Gothic works early. However, as the Italian Renaissance spreads, and he starts to get some of those influences, right? So later shows Italian Renaissance influences, which I'm shortening to ITREN. I'm not writing Renaissance out a million times, right? And so his style combines naturalistic detail of the Northern artists, naturalistic detail, which again is a key component of the Northern Renaissance, and the theoretical ideas of the Italian artists. The theory of art that we see in the Italian artists, right? He travels to Italy to study the kind of key works of the era, and then brings that back to Germany. Okay. right? And he wrote about theories of arts and published. So he wrote about theories of arts. Let's start there. And then on top of that, he also published a series of wood gravings and copper and carvings, woodcuts, and copper engravings. And the most famous of those being the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Which he makes in around 1498. Okay. And so finally, our last of the famed Northern Renaissance artists, and I feel like they kind of did the Northern Renaissance a little dirty here. I think there's a lot more to talk about. Hans Holbein the Younger, not to be confused with Hans Holbein the Elder, who lives from 1497 to 1543. Okay. He is considered one of the greatest Renaissance portraitists, which means he really focused on portraits, right, of people, right? He's born in Germany, but he is best known for his English work, right? Known for his work in England, especially as the court painter of Henry VIII, the same Henry VIII who created the Anglican Church, right? So he becomes court painter to Henry VIII. Right. So his portrait of Henry VIII shows his talent for presenting details. Let's add talent in there. His talent for presenting details. And then also his ability to capture the psychological character of his subjects. Okay. And so basically his art would become the model for English portraiture and English painting until the 19th century. Okay. And that is the Northern Renaissance, or at least the amount of the Renaissance in Northern Europe they talk about here. Pretty short, especially compared to the Southern Renaissance, and a lot less people to talk about. In the next section, we'll get into another quite large topic, which is the Baroque art. I wanted to break that off into its own thing. I'm going to try to make every one of these subtopics of this era into its own particular subject, or its own video, I should say. So we'll do a Baroque one, then we'll do Rococo, Neoclassicism, Romanticism in a video, then we'll do Realism, Impressionism, and so on and so forth until we get to the end of the Western art stuff. We might kind of combine a lot of the more modern stuff together, though. Pop art, minimalism, photorealism, realism, and then earthworks, installations, and performance. I think we will maybe combine those. But that's for another day and another video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.